My guest today is Hamish Fraser. That's a strange first name, Hamish. We'll talk about that later on. I've known Hamish for many years now, at least 10. He's the editor of a magazine I consider indispensable, namely Approaches Magazine. Anyone who pretends to be in the counter-revolution, anyone who's trying to fight the good fight on the side of Christ against the enemies of the church would be severely handicapped if he hasn't read this magazine, and we'll talk about that later on. But first I want to talk about Hamish the man, and I want to talk to Hamish the man. So you are born in Scotland and raised in Scotland, but you once joined the Communist Party. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, see, I was reared in the Church of Scotland. And,
is that what they call Presbyterian Church, right?
This is Presbyterian.
Presbyterian, right.
But by the time I was 14, I couldn't stomach the atmosphere anymore. It would be sheer hypocrisy to pretend it was an intellectual revulsion. It was an emotional one. I just couldn't stand the atmosphere in the church. And the paradoxical thing is now I find the very same atmosphere I ran away from as a boy of 14 in the Catholic Church.
And what was that about? The kind of flat boredom?
Well, yes, and I just found it wasn't tailored to human dimensions. But in any case, apart from the fact that I abandoned religion fairly early on, then, of course, I was a typical man of my generation. I was 18 when the economic crisis broke on the shores of the United Kingdom. And the bottom seemed to have fallen out of civilization.
What year is this about?
1931.
1931, yeah. Right. The First World War had been over for about 10 years, 12 years.
That's right.
Right. And England was in a bad depression, just like America.
Well, in America got it in 1929, but it didn't really begin to bite in the United Kingdom until about 1931 in a severe way. And with the bottom appearing to fall out of civilization, nobody having any answers or remedies for poverty in the midst of plenty and mass unemployment, it seemed to serve no purpose. There's no rhyme or reason about it. Well, like so many others of my generation, I began to ask, were there any answers at all? And, well, in my immediate vicinity, the only people who seemed to have any answers were the communists.
And where were they active? In the schools, in the waterfront, where? Oh,
no, the Communist Party was a rather small organization at that time. It wasn't very sophisticated. But at any rate, they claimed that communism, as personified in the Soviet Union, where there was no unemployment, for very good reason, which I subsequently appreciated, but didn't then, it seemed to be the answer to the problems of our capitalist economy.
Now, you're a young lad at the time. Yeah. How old are you?
Well, in 1931 I was 18.
18? Yeah. And had you gone to university?
I had, yes.
Pardon me?
I had, yes.
You had?
Yeah.
And so you had but you say it was more emotional. You saw this wretchedness and people out of work, no money, and you had heard of all these surpluses and so on. So there was a kind of puzzlement, and you thought the communists had the answer.
Well, they were the only people who claimed to have an answer at all.
Right.
I mean, of course, if I'd been a German, no doubt I'd been attracted towards the Nazi Party. It was a matter of chance, according to where one was and one's background, whether one became a communist or a Nazi or a fascist in Italy, because, most Catholics didn't know anything about the social doctrine of the Church, as I found later. In fact, very few clerics knew anything about the social doctrine of the Church. So there was little possibility of any of my generation turning towards the positive answer to the problems of our age. And, I would say that most of the thinking members of my generation who thought at all unless they were fortunate to have an understanding of the implications of the social implications of the Christian faith, they tended to go for one of these totalitarianisms.
Okay, so now you translated this new conviction into action. You actually went to Spain.
Oh yeah, but before that I became a member of the Young Communist League. And I was active in the Young Communist League in Scotland and then later in London. And then I went to Spain, which seemed to be the apocalypse, the revolutionary apocalypse.
And this is when General Franco, the communists had installed what they called the Republic, and General Franco tried to stop them. So
well, it wasn't quite so simple as that. I mean, you had the Bloodless Revolution in 1931 in Spain, which effected the secularization of Spain. And, of course, if you secularize a Catholic country, it's an invitation to chaos. And within 5 years, you had the situation in 1936, where eventually there was violence everywhere, and General Franco and the army rose to seize power. And against them there was the Republic, which it wasn't communist dominated to begin with, but very soon became communist dominated.
So now you lost that war, or the communists lost the civil war in Spain, and you came back still a communist?
Oh, very much more so. Because the one thing that I appreciated as a result of my experience in Spain was the organizing power of the party. There never was a more ramshackle republic than the Second Spanish Republic. But for the organizing power of the Communist Party, the war had probably been over by Christmas 1936. And by 1937, when, after the government, with communist support, of course, put down the Trotskyist anarchist forces in Barcelona, the Republic was divided in two. There was a wave of suspicion of all things governmental and communist. And it was only as a result of the organising power of the party that the Republic was kept on its feet until 1939, plus, of course, the logistical support from Moscow. But without the party to make use of the support, that would have been of no avail. So I came back to Britain conscious of the power of a small number of people to effect significant changes.
Now, how small a number? How small is small? Would you say 1% of the Spanish people were party members, or perhaps?
I can't remember the exact figures offhand, but it's always a very small proportion. And as a matter of fact, I would say the Spanish Civil War was a war of elites on both sides. On the one hand, you had the communists on the side of the Republic. On the nationalist side, you had the Carlists and the Phalangists. But the general body of the Spanish people on both sides weren't the slightest interested.
Which is the way it always is, right?
That's right, sure.
5% of the people can change the world.
That's right.
That's why sometimes people wonder what we're doing with a small resistance group, and they wonder why we don't get the hundreds of millions. But if we could get the elite, as you say, people with something to say, who know how to work together, we can shift the tide. Right. So, you're still a communist, and were you an atheist at the time?
Oh, it goes without saying. I mean, you can't be a communist without being an atheist.
So,
at least you can't be a communist properly understood. I mean, there were people who joined the party who may have some hangovers, religious hangovers, but I already lost mine.
You had okay.
Oh, yes.
Now, what brought you back? What brought you to God, or to abandon Marxism or communism?
Well, it's quite simple, really. That the only thing inevitable about communism is the inevitable disillusionment of the communist.
Right.
It's a more protracted process nowadays, for the simple reason that, well, up until the end of the last war, well, there was really only the Communist Party. The party was monolithic, monocentric, and there was no place else to turn if one was disillusioned with the party. But now the revolution has taken a heights variety, 57 different varieties, and people who are disillusioned with one branch can shop around, and the disillusionment process can take very much longer.
Yeah, I see what you mean. They can figure, well, it was betrayed in Moscow, but we'll try Peiping now. Or
That's
something.
right.
Whereas in your day, when one failed, that was the
That's right, but it was rather a simple process because, well, as I say, I was more convinced as a communist after the Civil War than I was before it. But then came along World War II, and I was overjoyed when World War II broke out because I could see Britain and France on the one hand against Germany on the other. And as a result of this imperialist war, there would be sooner or later a revolution, which would transform into a civil war, and we transform an imperialist war into a civil war, and the revolutionary utopia would arise. Now, it wasn't so simple as that, however, because when war was declared, the Communist Party in Great Britain, they came out with a pamphlet, How to Win the War. And that lasted for 5 or 6 weeks.
How to win? How the British should win the war?
No. How the communists would help the Allies to win the war.
Oh, I see. Right.
In other words, the party was continuing the anti-fascist struggle of prior to 1939. Well, that went on for about 6 weeks until a telegram came from Moscow saying that wasn't the situation at all. As the main enemy of the international working class was not Nazi Germany, but British and French imperialism. And it was our task to transform the imperialist war into a civil war. And from then until June 1941, that's precisely what we tried to do. The party line changed overnight to being transforming the imperialist war into a civil war.
Listen, I wonder, I've always heard about the party line. That's almost a joke among us. But you were still young at the time. If Moscow says 2 and 2 are 5, you were ready to repeat 2 and 2 are 5.
Well, the really loyal, hardline party man does precisely that. But after one's had a little experience, one begins to ask oneself questions. Well, in any case, this line lasted until June 22, 1941, when Soviet Union was invaded. Whereupon overnight the party line changed again, how to win the war, but all more so. And at this time, anybody who even threatened strike action, or mind took it, was expelled from the party. So we had all these political gymnastics within 18 months. And by this time I was working in a shipyard as a shop steward.
In Glasgow?
In Clydebank. John Brown's, the shipyard that built the Queens, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and George V battleship too. Now,
were you disillusioned by war?
No, by this time. I threw myself into the task of organising party groups in shipyards and engineering works throughout the Clyde, and with no little success. And I'd say by 1941, we virtually controlled the Clyde. All workplaces in the Clyde. Nothing could happen without our permission.
And when you say we, is it a labor
I'm talking
union?
about the party.
Yes, but was it a labor? When you say you organised, what does that mean? You collect dues from people, you get their allegiance?
No, we organise party groups.
Yes.
And cells, whatever you call them. And the point is that a small number of people can control a vast number, provided they're properly organised. For example, in John Brown's shipyard, I doubt if there were more than a couple of dozen really conscious communists. There was a number of people who joined the party out of enthusiasm for Soviet Russia, this kind of thing, but they weren't really communists. But the real hardline party men, there would probably be a couple of dozen in a work employing about 12,000 people.
And they were enough, though.
What?
They were enough. You could...
quite enough. We controlled the whole yard, and it wasn't difficult because, you see, we were very strong in the shop stewards movement, and when meetings, when a trade union meeting was arranged to discuss something or other, well, we as a party met as a fraction beforehand and planned what we were going to do at the meeting. Now, one example, there were some people in the engineering union, they were moving for a strike. Now, I wasn't in the engineering, I was in the foundry workers union, but I was the party group leader in John Brown's Engine and Parlour Works at the time. So I got all the party men in the AEU, the engineers union, together, and I planned it meticulously beforehand. Arranged, for example, for one person to move the motion, another to second it, and then for various other people to interject and bring out certain points. In fact, I wrote a 45-minute speech and parcelled it out so that our whole case was said systematically by people appearing to jump up spontaneously and just say off the top of their head what they thought. Well, they knew what they were going to say in advance and what points they were going to bring forward. Well, the others, they were acting spontaneously. And for something to appear spontaneous, well, it's got to be very highly organised.
Yes.
But our side appeared to be completely spontaneous, and the result at the meeting was that eventually the movers of the motion apologised. And I wasn't at the meeting myself, but I mean, it was hours and hours of work went into planning this beforehand. And what I want to stress is that, well, a small number of highly organised men in a trade union or in a workshop, their power to control the masses is comparable to the power of half a dozen mounted policemen to disperse a crowd of as many thousands.
Yes, yes. Now, what made you finally disillusioned? So far you're telling me of success.
Yeah, well, the point is that being a shop steward, I had to answer, and an active party worker, I had to answer all kinds of questions of being asked by all kinds of awkward people, Trotskyists and members of the Labour Party and so on and so on. How do you explain all these changes in the party line? Now, at the time, the party was saying that eventually Pam Dutt was going to write a book in which all would be revealed, you see. But the book kept being postponed and postponed.
Who was going to write the book?
Pam Dutt, who was the leading theoretician of the party.
An American?
No,
I mean,
well, he's I think he's Swedish Indian origins, but I mean, he was the leading theoretician of the British Communist Party.
Oh, I see. Okay, right.
And but this book, it kept on being postponed. I don't know if it was ever published. It wasn't published by the time I left the party. But in any case, being an outsizing fools, I jumped in where the party angels fear to tread, and I wrote a pamphlet, An Intelligent Socialist Guide to World War II, in which I proposed to explain the inexplicable and to justify all these political gymnastics in terms of Marxism-Leninism. And I sent it down to the party leadership. Harry Pollitt, who was the general secretary of the party, he thought it was the greatest things in sliced bread, ordered its publication. It was published in the maximum number that could be published there, 10,000, and sold, immediately.
This is during World War II.
That's right.
And so, an intelligent guide to...
An intelligent socialist guide to World War II.
That's right.
It's a play on Shaw's book.
Right. Okay.
But in any case, the impact was quite considerable. I was assured by some party workers that people who had been Trotskyites, they decided to beat their breasts and rejoin the party. But the interesting thing about it is, having written it, I realised that it was sophistry from beginning to end, and I was mortally ashamed of it. And from then on, I was a dissident convict. I realised that one could justify it only in terms of the British party obeying Moscow's line slavishly, that in fact the British Communist Party, like all the others, had been nationalised or denationalised rather, and it was just a hand rag at Moscow's disposal.
You know, Solzhenitsyn wrote a letter to the communist leaders recently, and the title was "Live Not the Lie." So it seems to me you had written the lie.
That's right.
And your conscience bothered you.
Well, no, I saw that there was pure sophistry after it was in print.
But when you were writing it, You didn't think that?
Well, when I was writing it, I was thinking of all the arguments that I could adduce to prove the thesis that I was advancing.
Yes, yes.
And I was so involved in doing that I hadn't time to reflect on it. But once it was published and I looked at it, I was ashamed of it. And I realized then that the Communist Party of Great Britain was just a slave of Moscow. And my dissonance took the typical form, there was nothing original about it, the same form, in a minor way, that Tito's dissonance took. Tito, he realized that if Yugoslavia remained part of Russia, that he would probably end up with a head on his shoulders. So he decided to become a Stalin in his own right. And in other words, he wanted a communism for Yugoslavia. Well, I, in my own way, groping way, I wanted a communist organization that was independent of Moscow.
So you still had this illusion that the communists had the right idea.
No, I was still a Marxist-Leninist, but I didn't want a Marxism-Leninism that was bowed to suit Moscow's needs.
I get you, right. So, okay, keep talking now.
Yeah.
You're still an atheist.
Yeah, very much so. And, but the point is that then it's incredible now, but at a party meeting I moved. Well, you see, the Comintern in the interim had been dissolved, apparently, see? Actually, the direction still kept up, but formally the Comintern, the Communist International, ceased to exist.
That was their headquarters, say, you know.
No, it was the organization of all communist parties. Well, taking a leaf out of Moscow's book, I advocated the dissolution of the British Party and the reformation of a native British revolutionary Marxist organization. Well, I proposed that at a party meeting, and well, that was the end of a beautiful friendship. In the sense that once one's dissonance becomes apparent, one becomes a non-person. And eventually, it was protracted, it took a considerable period, but eventually I wrote into the party leadership, intimating that I resigned from the party. So I got a reply, which is typical. It wasn't, dear Mr. Fraser, dear enemy, or dear anything at all. There was no name. It was the party committee discussed your case on the night and decided that you're more or less an enemy of the working class. But I had become a non-person. There was no manner in which I could be addressed.
Yeah. And did this hurt you? When Whittaker Chambers left the Communist Party, he had no faith to clutch to, and he felt as if his whole life had lost its meaning. Would you say the same thing as you?
Sure. But the point is that, well, once a communist leaves the party, it has a traumatic influence on him. It's equivalent to a priest leaving the priesthood or leaving the church, because we were the priest of the revolution. And the fact of leaving the party transforms one's whole life, in the sense that all one's relationships had been built up in the party, and one was cut off from everything that one had been associated with before. And the thing that I couldn't fathom out for myself was why the ideal of revolutionary Marxism had ended in the tyranny of Stalin, of which I was becoming even then aware, because, well, I had read Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, and it had a tremendous impact on communists. Because I think it's one of the most important novels of the century. And I was increasingly aware of the true nature of communist tyranny in Russia. And I was asking myself why the ideals of revolutionary Marxism had resulted in this unspeakable tyranny. And strangely enough, I only began to understand the machinations in Moscow when I began to reflect on some historical developments in the Elizabethan period in England. And then, but the one thing that really made me aware of what was what was when I happened to come across Lord Acton's famous axiom that power corrupting absolutely. Now, that explained everything to me, because what I realised is the Lord Acton didn't know what he was talking about. When he was talking about absolute power, he was talking about the power of an absolute monarch, which was less than that of a democratic minister today.
Yes, yes.
And he didn't know what absolute power looked like. Now, under communism, you have, first of all, you had all the means of distribution, exchange, and nationalised in the hands of the state. The state controlled by the party, and in Moscow, controlled by one man, in effect. So you had a concentration of power such as had never existed in history before. And even Stalin had begun as a saint, who had been sufficiently corrupt. And of course he was no saint. And therefore I realised that quite apart from the false ideas of Marxism, the very fact of concentrating power couldn't but corrupt a society. So at this stage I realised that there was something wrong with Marxism as such, but I didn't know the answer. And it just at this juncture, I met a friend who subsequently became my godfather, and he introduced me to the social doctrine of the church.
This is John Kemple.
That's right.
Yeah, very nice gentleman. I've met him myself. Now, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
He's from Scotland also. Was he a Catholic?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
And did you have many Catholics at the time in Scotland?
Oh, there's about 700,000 or 800,000 Catholics in Scotland, out of 5 million.
And therefore, by a providential chance, if you will, here comes a man who knew, he not only was a Catholic, but he knew the social doctrine of the church.
Yeah, but he's one of the very few. But the point is, there wasn't altogether chance, because you see, he was related to me through marriage.
Right.
You see? And, but he was worried about, he saw my wife, who had been a Catholic, and who had joined up in the party with me, and he saw her going to hell for all eternity unless something were done about it. So he came along to see me, and we became friends. But the important thing is that when he introduced me to the social doctrine of the church, I could see what was the answer to the evils of monopoly capitalism. Not the abolition of private property, but its wider distribution. Right. Of course, that's what we're simplifying the social doctrine of the church. But it was that when I saw that, I began to reflect, well, how is it that this organization, which I had always considered to be medieval obscurantism at its very worst, and fit only for women and children, and for them, how is it that this organization, founded by a carpenter and an obscure outpost of empire 2,000 years ago, how it alone seemed to have the answer to the problems of the 20th century? And the more I reflected on this, the more I began to reflect on it, and till eventually, I met priests and started to discuss the theological implications for all this.
By the way, did the priest know the social doctrine of the church, the ones you met?
The one that I met at the time, he wasn't very well aware of it, but as soon as he saw what my problem was, he interested himself, and he primed himself on the social doctrine of the church, so he'd discuss something intelligibly.
When you say the social doctrine of the church, where... explain that further. Where does one find it, or where did one find it in your day?
Again, in Britain, the small particle of the social doctrine of the church that was introduced to me sufficed to interest me in the church as such. But in England, as in America too, as most English-speaking countries, the social doctrine of the church as presented was simply Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno.
Those are two encyclicals by Rerum Novarum
Louis XIII and Pius XI.
Right.
And really, to appreciate the significance of the teaching of these encyclicals, one must see them within the context of the immense corpus of Catholic social doctrine. And the one which I subsequently became aware of was that while everyone had heard, even people who didn't know what there was in the encyclical, that most of them had heard of Rerum Novarum, scarcely anyone had heard of Humanum Genus, written by the same Pope.
Which is about what?
Which is an encyclical where he calls for Freemasons to be unmasked.
Oh, that's quite interesting, yes. Well, you know, let me interrupt you here because this is a tale of two continents, or you're on the island of Scotland, or part of the island, and I am on the mainland of America. I had probably the best Catholic education available to a person in my lifetime. I was born in 1928, good Catholic grade school, good Catholic high school, and believe it or not, there was enough consciousness of the social doctrine of the church that they used to have essay contests for youngsters to write essays, and I even won one prize. It was not on the social doctrine of the church, but in all this time I repeated things that I didn't understand. And it seems to me, in retrospect, it was thanks to my reading you 10 years ago that I, who have been in Catholic education my entire life, that I finally began to understand what one means by social justice. And it's strange that we had goodwill, you had the encyclicals being read, you had priests taking the trouble to try to implement them, but for whatever reason there didn't seem to be an understanding of it. But you somehow did. You understood. Well, of course, you saw the problem. We probably had the answer without the problem.
The social doctrine of the church is meaningless except as far as never made to implement it faithfully.
Right.
And very little effort had been made to implement it. So its practical relevance wasn't seen. And as a matter of fact, where efforts were being made, many of them were somewhat dishonest. For example, in Britain, the Catholic Social Guild purported to popularize and make the social doctrine of the church understood. But a very large proportion of those interested in the social doctrine of the church were socialists, members of the Labour Party. And what was done, as often as not, was the encyclicals were looked at through a telescope backwards to find quotations which could be used to justify belonging to the Labour Party.
You know, that almost sounds like today, doesn't it? Yeah. You're talking about 1945 or...
Yeah, I'm talking about the post-war period.
Post-war period, a post-World War I period.
Post-World War II period.
So you had a group allegedly teaching papal doctrine on society and pushing their own socialist ideas.
Yes.
Now, let's get to, as you know, right now there's a big controversy among the Americans about capitalism, socialism, and so on. You had a very important statement. You said the problem was capitalism, and the answer is not the abolition of private property, but the wider distribution. What do you mean when you say the problem was capitalism? Is there a historical, identifiable type of economy that you're referring to?
Well, when I said capitalism, I wasn't meaning free enterprise society. I was meaning what happened when you got the development of monopoly.
You had the Carnegies, the Fords, these big empires.
That's right. And you had this concentration of power in too few hands in the capitalist world. Not comparable to what happened in the communist world.
No.
And then, of course, the proletariat felt alienated. Whereas, for example, the popes proposed means whereby profit sharing, a measure of co-partnership would be encouraged. But of course, always without interfering with rights of management.
Right.
And Pius XI's program, the real program of the church, was the development of a cooperative economy where the state's function would simply direct and complement and assist the social body. And whereas the various industries would be professionally organized as sort of autonomous republics, except insofar they wouldn't be permitted to take advantage of their monopoly position against other sections of society.
Right. Let's stop there because I have the hardest time visualizing. Do you say in the 20th century, at whatever decade of the 20th century, has the social doctrine of the church come anywhere near being implemented? Say what you know about America. You know enough about how we invest, and we have quite a bit of free enterprise. Yeah. Would you say we're close to what the popes want?
Well, if one takes the United Kingdom rather than America, I know more about it.
Right.
Well, now, at the present time, one has a society in Britain that's been socialized up the eyeballs. And Mrs. Thatcher was seeking to redress the position somewhat. And the one successful thing she did, she contained Scargill's industrial terrorism. She introduced a reform of trade union law to prevent a trade union monopoly from dictating to industry. And she also been seeking to privatise part of the economy to break down the concentration of power. And in many respects, she's a remarkable woman. But unfortunately, she doesn't have a context within which to do all these things, and the result is that she appears more than anything else like a 19th century economic liberal. And, for instance, at the present time, I would say that having curbed trade union excesses, the emphasis should be on cooperating with moderate trade unions and building up a cooperative spirit in the country, encouraging industrial peace by incorporating the same representatives of labour into the economy without making possible a regrowth of the excesses that was taken before.
Which would, in a way, what you want is to break down monopoly power and also give workers a piece of the action. Let them know that their good is somehow involved in the success of the enterprise.
To go back again to about 1951, when the Tory party came back into power, and they had about 12 years uninterrupted power in the United Kingdom. Well, paradoxically, they did more to destroy small property than the Labour Party had done, not by nationalisation, but by facilitating the development of monopolies that were quite unnecessary and the concentration of economic power in ever fewer hands.
Right.
And in fact, they were destroying their own mass basis, because their main support was small enterprise and small businesses, where you had power and diffused, and people capable of conscious of their power.
Yes.
Whereas they liquidated their own mass bases, and now Mrs. Thatcher is talking about reviving small industries. But paradoxically, the Conservative Party did more to destroy small property than the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And it's a lack of an all-embracing global perspective. But of course, one doesn't expect that without a Christian outlook, and unfortunately that's her weakness. She doesn't seem to have any Christian outlook at all.
Religion. But let's keep moving on then to your odyssey toward the faith. Right, you're still a communist, you're disillusioned with this or that control, but what finally brought you to, there was the papal encyclicals which let you take a second look at the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, of course, when anyone is converted to the Church, there are so many different strands that go to make up one's, the logistics of grace takes so many forms that it's practically impossible in retrospect to see them all. Some of the things one wasn't even aware of, perhaps. But one aspect of my evolution of that period, which is vital, is that in 1945 I undertook a course of teacher training, and I found to my dismay that I had to take a course of religious education, and to me that was the final insult. I mean, I felt my masculinity was assailed by expecting that I should consider religious instruction seriously, because although I was no longer a communist, I considered myself more Marxist than the Red Pope. And when I went to the training college, I found there was a prize for religious knowledge. So I said, well, if I've got to take this thing, I'm going to thumb my nose at God in the most effective way that I can by getting this damn prize to show my utter contempt for the whole business. And it was sheer pride that drove me in this respect, nothing else. And I couldn't have given a damn about the subject or the prize. But I was so determined that I would get it. It wasn't difficult, but it was very little competition.
Yeah.
I mean, it was basically. But the point is that in the course of that year, I studied religion for the first time, since I left the church. Well, I never studied before, really. Well, to cut a long story short, by the time I got the prize, I could no longer say with my hand on my heart, there is no God. I wasn't a Christian. I hadn't come to the stage of believing in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I couldn't say there is no God. Now, this was the crossing of the Rubicon, as far as that's concerned. Because as a communist, while it's true, as the Church teaches, that one can arrive at belief in the existence of God through the use of reason. That's the teaching of the Church.
Right.
The point is that if one has been a communist from the teenage onward, one's mind was so obscured by materialistic prejudices that one wasn't free to use one's reason. And it was when I arrived at the point where I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say there is no God, and my mind was open, my reason could then operate. And of course the other processes I was describing, they were going on simultaneously.
Okay, now there was therefore no one dramatic moment, although we're getting to a climax. Now, when did you finally get full assent to Catholic faith?
Well, it was 1948.
And did that come gradually too, or did you wake up?
I was 3 years in what you could describe as a spiritual wilderness, and very painful. During that period, I suffered from insomnia for the first time in my life. I never suffered from it since either. But such was the traumatic effect that I was striving to find some means of explaining what I found to be inexplicable. You see, the one thing about communism is that, as compared to Protestantism, Protestantism is essentially eclecticism. You take a little of this, a little of that, it's sort of like an Irish stew, and all these things are happening together, quite unrelated. But the communist has a Weltanschauung, an all-embracing philosophy in which everything is related to everything else. In other words, the communist has a hunger for the absolute,
yes.
An absolute that's inverted. In fact, the Communist Party is the mystical body of Satan, the Church of Christ turned upside down and inside out. But once one leaves the party, what one was left was the hunger for the absolute. And we found nowhere else except in the Church.
And for a consistent system.
That's right.
Yes. Instead of picking and choosing. So, did you finally ask to be baptized? You had never been baptized as a Protestant.
Oh, yes.
You had
baptized as a Protestant. Oh, yes.
But it didn't matter to you, no. So, you'd say around 1948 then
That's right.
It dawned on you that the Roman Catholic Church had this creed.
Well, before I had finally made up my mind, I did come to the decision I wanted my children brought up as Christians. So I had my marriage rectified, and the children began to go to Catholic school.
And your wife acquiesced?
Oh, yes.
Yes. And now, and then finally you were received, was it a famous man who received you, Father McNabb, or any priest?
No, it was a tragedy that Father Stevenson, who received me, he eventually apostatized in 1967. After that, he received Walton Hannah into the church too. He was a Jesuit. And just before the council, he went to Canada, an ecumenical posting in McMaster University, Hamilton, Ontario. And I think he was, in a sense, deracinated at the very moment of the council. And previously, he had been the expert in work among Anglicans, and as such, he had been successful in receiving quite a considerable number of Anglican ministers into the church. One of whom was Walton Hannah, the hero Darkness Visible, the expert in Freemasonry.
No, I don't know him.
But the point is, he was quite an outstanding convert. But then, in the wake of the council, working in McMaster University, Hamilton, Ontario, he himself became an Anglican.
That's strange. I've known you for at least 10 years, and I'm reading your approaches. I think that's the one journal I read cover to cover. It has so many interesting aspects. I want to first give the address of this, and your address is 1 Waverly Place, Salt Coates, SALTCOATS, and the postal code is KA215AX. In American money, how much is a subscription a year? It's $10 a year.
$10.
That's a cheap thing. You're not making any money on this. It comes out 4 or 5 times a year, right?
4 times.
4 times a year. As you say, it's an occasional journal, but it contains some of the most original, serious thinking and writing I've ever seen. And I've noticed in my careful reading of approaches, you have many themes, but you keep harping back to the kingship of Christ. So let's talk about that for a while. What is this doctrine of Christ the King?
Well, it is that Christ is king, and that because he is king, all power is given to him in heaven and earth, on earth as well as in heaven. So therefore, our job is to work so as to make society conform to the laws of Christ the King, to the laws of God. I mean, that is our job as laymen, defined by Vatican II, incidentally, Article 31 of Lumen Gentium.
And do you see, now again, I who had a great Catholic background, whenever the Feast of Christ the King was celebrated, I believe I used a missal, but I don't know if I read it that carefully. It seemed to me I got away with this platitude, well, Christ is King in my heart, which I really tried to live up to. But then the minute I saw doctors' guilds, lawyers' guilds, schools, and so on, it seemed to me, well, what's wrong with Christ reigning in my private heart and your private heart and your private heart? Why should we impose a religion on a society? And you know that's what's ripping America apart now. I think was in good faith and moderately informed, and maybe most people are still in good faith and moderately informed, but they would look at you, and if they finally understood what you're saying, you really want Christ to dominate the public world. Well, how do you answer this? You're imposing something on people.
In the first place, one must understand what one's doing. And the Feast of Christ's Kingship was introduced by Pius XI in 1925 with the encyclical letter Quos Primus, which I'm afraid then got the same treatment as Humanae Vitae got later. It was published, but never taken seriously. And I don't think I've ever heard a sermon preached on Christ's kingship that referred to what it's all about.
Well, what is it about again?
In effect, it is the fact that Christ is king of the whole of society, of governments as well as, and of organizations as well as of private persons.
And therefore, but would this not logically lead to what people call a theocracy? Let's say in Ireland, which is a smaller country than America, a group of intellectuals, fervent Catholics got together, and we decided to make Christ the King of Ireland. Well, does this violate rights of Jews? Does this violate rights of secular people? By what authority, in other words, do we plant the flag of Christ into the secular city?
Well, if you're taking Ireland, it's a very appropriate place to take in the first place. The Republic of Ireland was 95% Catholic.
Right.
And the Constitution of the Republic, which was published in 1937, it had one very grave defect. And that is that it stated the church was the church with the majority, not the one true church. Had it pronounced that the church was the one true church, then, for example, when the Supreme Court had to discuss the McGee judgment, it would have automatically had to refer what it was discussing to the teachings of the magisterium of the one true church to which the Republic was dedicated.
And would you call that a confessional state then, if in the Constitution, what makes a state confessional?
Well, I don't like the word confessional,
right.
Confessional state as such.
What makes a state a Catholic state? Well, it's not enough that the citizens be Catholic.
No, it's necessary for the state to acclaim Christ as King and to acclaim the laws of God as the laws which should prevail in society.
So in other words, if we had a true Catholic state, abortion could never be allowed.
Oh, no. Apart from a Catholic state, even if you had a semi-Catholic state that's concerned only the Ten Commandments, a state that was based on obedience to the Ten Commandments would be a Catholic state in embryo, because the implications of the Ten Commandments are, of course, the social teaching of the Church.
Right. So, and now how do we answer people, though? I just had a term paper from a very nice student of mine who wonders why the government should, why doesn't the government legitimate sodomy? Why doesn't the government legitimate porn? His whole answer is, why should anyone force a private view on other people? But what is the Catholic answer?
Well, paradoxically, they wouldn't take that attitude to the abolition of slavery.
Say that again?
They wouldn't take that attitude to the abolition of slavery.
No, of course not. Of course not.
Well, slavery, while an evil, it's not the worst of evils. But the need to abolish it epitomizes the need to impose God's will and God's laws on society as a whole.
For the sake of the real freedom of society.
Exactly.
That's really our answer.
Sure.
So I love the way people congratulate themselves that today we're free, there's no bishop looking over anyone's shoulder, and we can do anything we want. But first of all, you can't walk on most streets, they're unsafe. Secondly, you can't go to most entertainment, you can't bring a decent person to entertainment. So we're really not free.
No. But, and as a matter of fact, it comes out increasingly clear that we're living in a society that is so enslaved to sin that there really is only one human right that's absolute, and that's the right to sin in no matter what form, the right to blaspheme, not only against God and person, but against His creation and in death. And, for example, when anyone relates smoking to lung cancer as vicious propaganda against smoking, although it's not altogether true, but that's beside the point. Drunk driving and road accidents, the fewest of penalties on drunk driving. And so one could quote umpteen examples and say, but when there's any relationship of cervical cancer to precocious sex and the use of the pill, which is proven up the hilt, nobody wants to know anything about it, not even the relationship of AIDS to sodomy. Because the one human right of our society is the right to sin in no matter what form, the right to blaspheme against creation, against life. And that is what human rights, as interpreted in a post-Christian society, really means.
Now, this doctrine of the social kingship of Christ obviously is not going to come out of nowhere. It's going to be realized through serious Catholic statesmen, writers, and so on. And tell me how you feel about Catholics in politics today. Are you? I don't know how things are in the United Kingdom, but in this country, most of the Catholics who enter politics, to me, betray Christ.
Oh, yeah. Because they are just party politicians. And I was just reading just last night, as a matter of fact, a quotation from Belloc about party politics. And he said that nothing else can explain why intelligent men utter such imbecilities as the existence of the party system. As a matter of fact, I go so far as to say, if you'd had the party system in Eden, you wouldn't have needed the serpent.
So you yourself, this would bring us to this question of democracy. The Church, of course, teaches that the Church can live with many forms of government, whether it's a monarchy or a democracy or a dictatorship or something like that. But what would, do you think democracy is all that favorable to the Catholic state? To Christ the King?
Well, it depends what it means by democracy. I mean, I'm a representative government, yes.
Yes.
Party democracy, no.
Well, how do you get one without the other? How would I get representative government without party democracy?
Well, find the need for parties. Ask that question, why the need for parties? Because at the present juncture, our party democracy is run by parties which in effect are Box versus Cox versus Rocks versus Knox. On essentials, they've all got the same policy. For example, in Great Britain, all the parties are permissive, equally permissive. One has the right to make, we vote by making a cross in England. What I call a blasphemous sign across every 5 years to choose between parties which morally are indistinguishable. One has no freedom, in fact.
Well, how would you, would this be a change in mere election laws? Supposing you wanted serious representative government without a party, how would people start choosing? Would it be more subsidiarity, more at the local level? You would choose someone you trust?
Well, I think people would be chosen by, for example, professions, by various organizations to which they belong. And
different estates.
That's right. And you would have different houses representing the various professions. On certain things, you might have a referendum to get the general consensus of opinion.
Yes.
But I mean, what we have is a party dictatorship. And for example, in the United Kingdom, there have been umpteen opinion polls concerning, for instance, capital punishment. And the overwhelming majority of people want a capital punishment restored. But the political parties, they just refuse to even consider it.
Whereas abortion, of course, they tolerate that.
That's right.
That to me is part of the greatest hypocrisy when we have a so-called Catholic governor of New York who has ambitions to be president, Mario Cuomo. He constantly vetoes a bill for capital punishment for horrible crimes on the pretext that only God can take a human life. And meanwhile, he's pushing to fund abortion and funding and recognizing gay rights. So this is extremely distressing. Do you know any good Catholic statesmen in I don't say in England, but anywhere? Would you give me an example of someone whom you admire?
Well, quite frankly, I'm not saying he's perfectly any man, and he's not Catholic even. But I would say the only person one could come within a stone's throw of describing as a Christian statesman is President Reagan.
That's quite interesting because he is being hooted down and treated as if he's the Antichrist and so on.
Yeah.
Why would you say that, though? What features would encourage you in looking for him as a Christian statesman?
Very, very simple. For example, there is no other statesman that I know of in the Western world, and certainly not in the Eastern world, that has urged people to defend the right to life, apart from President Reagan. And, for example, when he visited Ireland, I said practically everything he said was theocentric. I watched him on television, his inauguration speech. It was thoroughly God-centered. Well, I don't know of any other politician who speaks in that language. For example, to compare with Charlie Haughey, who's the leader of the opposition in Ireland, the one party that has got something of the Fianna Fáil De Valera tradition left. Well, in the course of his address to the Ardèche, the sort of AGM of his party, not once did he mention the name of God, not once, nor did John F. Kennedy when he came to Ireland at the time. No, but Reagan is continually referring everything to God. Now, he's not a Catholic, but when you compare him, for instance, to Mrs. Thatcher, who claims to admire him, but I only wish you'd emulate him.
Yes. I agree with that. I think sometimes I say the American people have better than they deserve, but on the other hand, it could be that in this country, for all its sins and for all its toleration of abortion, there is a serious group of fervent Catholics and fervent God-fearing people, so perhaps we do deserve it.
Yeah, and I think also that if the church were visible as it once was, I think the harvest of souls would exceed what happened in the early days of the church.
And of course, the church thinks just the opposite. So many people are so timid, feeling as if, among the lower ranks, not among the Pope, but as if we proclaim the fullness of Catholic doctrine, we'll somehow alienate people.
But I feel that the one thing that becomes more obvious as time goes on is this question of human rights, the right to sin. And paradoxically, I think the attitude to capital punishment on the part of the establishment reflects this too. Because whereas capital punishment is the punishment of the guilty, abortion is the punishment of the innocent. But abortion is the right to sin. And I always suspect that in their heart of hearts, those who oppose capital punishment do so because they know they merit it.
That's quite interesting. We have a couple of minutes left. You have been interested in the Blessed Virgin, but above all, Our Lady of Fatima. You somehow relate the Fatima message to the politics of the world.
Oh, yes, obviously. Because, Our Lady of Fatima, she is, in effect, asking us to be good Christians. And that, in effect, is the message. She also wants Russia consecrated to her Immaculate Heart. But that won't happen until a sufficient number of us do pray sufficiently and do enough penance.
And I think we are getting some direction now from the present Pope. I know we're not, he still has not perfectly conformed of consecrating the world, Russia to the Immaculate Heart, but at least he has made a beginning. I've been talking with Hamish Fraser from Scotland, as you might have suspected from the brogue. We've been talking about Hamish's conversion to the Church and his real apostolate in Catholic journalism. And may you, in the listening audience, get to know and read his thought very well. Thanks a lot, Hamish.
Okay.